Welcome to Stories from the NNI. This series features voices from the U.S. National Nanotechnology Initiative. I'm Lisa Friedersdorf, Director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office. For World Water Day, I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Terry Dankovich, Chief Technology Officer of Folia Water. Terry invented and tested the nanosilver-coated paper filters that Folia Water produces. She also discussed with us the challenges of transitioning from a researcher to an entrepreneur. Terry, thank you for being with us today. Could you please tell us a little bit about your work creating your paper filters?
Yeah, so I started this project during my PhD, and that was a lot of proof of concept laboratory work of synthesizing nanoparticles in paper and then testing it to see if it could kill microbes, mainly E. coli. And after I graduated, I went to the University of Virginia Center for Global Health and did a postdoc where I worked in both Virginia and South Africa on testing these filter papers with rural water samples from South Africa. And that was like kind of the motivation to really take the project from a laboratory scientific project to the first steps of forming a company and commercialization of the technology.
Could you talk a little bit to the approach that you took with respect to non-toxic chemicals or renewable materials?
When I started my PhD, I was interested in basically working with renewable materials, paired with a professor who works with cellulose nanocrystals, Dr. Derek Gray, and, was just kind of interested in doing something with cellulose, to be honest. I wasn't particularly focused on water purification at first, but, started to learn more and more about silver nanoparticles and how that would work with water filters and other materials, and just thought it was a really great opportunity. I started to get into it. And so I always had this idea that it was a good idea to, follow principles of green chemistry, and some of my early synthesis methods use things like sodium borohydride, which is commonly used to make nanoparticles, but I didn't really like the fact that it was so reactive. It's like, that probably isn't going to be good if you're going to work in trying to scale this. So I was looking for alternative methods and ended up finding different ways to make the nanoparticles that you just use plant-based materials and things like heat and, like kind of normal chemical reducing agents, really.
So you mentioned silver nanoparticles for their antimicrobial properties. What made you think to use these particles in combination with paper for filters?
The combination of silver and copper nanoparticles on paper, I was not the first person to do that by any means. Well, maybe for copper actually, but for silver I was definitely not. But the idea of using it in a water filter as a paper-based membrane, probably I was one of the first or early people to do such a project. Silver and copper nanoparticles have been long reported to be antimicrobial, so it was more just something worth exploring in research, where it's like, oh, well, people are doing a lot of work on this. Let's see how it works with paper. That was kind of question one, was like, oh, can this work as proof of concept? And then, like, what's the best way to make it on the paper? So it was started to be more look at how do you get a release of the ions, which are probably the main reason why they're antimicrobial, to the microbes, but not release everything all at once, which would be a very short-lasting filter. So we have this combo of a filter paper that can strain out some things and also release biocide or disinfectant into the water to give like a residual effect.
So now that you've determined how to combine that physical filter with the paper and the biocide with the nanoparticles, what motivated you to commercialize this as a product?
I would say several different things came together around the same time. I had concluded, or was wrapping up, I hadn't quite concluded my postdoc at UVA, and was thinking, oh, well, what should I do next? And kind of got a cold call from an ad agency called DDB in New York, who I was a little confused why they were contacting me, to be honest, being a PhD level scientist that was fresh out of her PhD, more or less. So I was like, why would they want to talk to me? Like, I don't do ads. That's not my thing. But then they basically were the ad agencies do a lot of pro bono ads these days for nonprofits, and they were working with a nonprofit called Water is Life. And so we made the drinkable book video. It was a several month to almost a year collaboration to get that off the ground. And I kind of just did that because I was interested in seeing, what would happen if I were to tell the world about this idea. I was like, well, I guess this is one way to get the word out. Ads are usually effective doing that. I wasn't quite prepared for what all happened next. There was a lot of media coverage, which was exciting and overwhelming at the same time because I hadn't even really had much practice talking to general media about such things. So, you don't want to be too detailed with the science for a general audience. It can be very tedious. At any rate, the news coverage led to a lot of literal customer demand of a product that we hadn't even made yet. So it was literally like handmade at that point, or hand treated, I should say. There was a lot of things that I was a little bit like, oh, I guess I should have maybe thought about all those things that I didn't know to think about. But seeing the strong interest, it basically was the first step. I wasn't going to just let possibly just Americans that were interested, or maybe, wealthier countries, because that wasn't really what my aim was. My aim was more that this was a really cheap filter. Like, wouldn't it be great to help with the water crisis internationally? So I took that media coverage and put it to good use, and worked with a couple nonprofits after that to do some field trials. And I went to Ghana, Bangladesh, Honduras, and South Africa again. We did a bunch of customer engagement and also water sample collection, and got a lot more information. With all of that combined was what led to the Foley Water being formed in January 2016. So yeah, it's the coming together of the customer demand and engagement and seeing the effectiveness of the filters in real world situations that led me, which are often things that you do in a startup after you form the startup, not before, but we things in a somewhat logical way here.
You mentioned where you've done these field trials, and you've been really in many different regions of the world to test your filters. You note on your website that one of your challenges is to create culturally appropriate filter holders. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of working with local people to be more effective with your product?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that we saw from doing the field trials was that different parts of the world had all these different water containers. Like, you may see jerry cans, soda bottles, kind of clay pots, and other sorts of ways to collect water or store water in the household. So that was something that we saw pretty quickly. And we also asked questions like, would you buy a container to have a water filter in? How much would you spend on such a container? And, sort of those like willingness to pay. And, a lot of people were like, well, I would, think about filtering my water, but I don't want to buy all that other stuff. That's going to cost, a good fraction of their income to buy things like a bucket. And you might be like, oh, that's kind of sad in some ways, but do you really need a bucket, or can you use just what's already there? So we set aside that design constraint of trying to use water containers that are already present in each of these areas. And although we don't have necessarily a completely universal design, we tried to make it as universal as we could, and decided at this point to go with the idea of attaching to a 2-liter soda bottle, because that thread on the 2-liter soda bottle for Coke and Pepsi and many of the major brands is the same thread. So it's a universal thread, whether you're in Africa, Asia, North America, South America, wherever you are. Coke and Pepsi have the same thread, so you can attach plastic parts to it pretty easily. So that was like something that we had decided upon. However, there's other designs that we find might be more prevalent in certain areas than others. So to make the most universal design is a real challenge. That's why we might need to do more region-specific designs.
That's just a great example of where standards are so important, and having that thread that's common is really a benefit to what you're trying to do. Could you talk a little bit about how you have interacted with the National Nanotechnology Initiative?
I do work at the Sing Nano Center at Penn. Occasionally I'll use the SEM there. We received a grant for free SEM time. It's really great that Sing Nano does that, to be honest, because when cash is tight, you think, oh, well, do I really need to look at this under the SEM? No, I'll spend that $200 on something else, right? So that's a really great program for, I would say, material science startups.
Well, that's a great example because the National Nanotechnology Coordinated Infrastructure is one of the real flagships for infrastructure of the NNI. So that's a fantastic example. I'm glad to hear that that's helpful to you.
So there are things like that I think the more that's like advertised for material science and nanomaterial startups, that's the better. Like it's really intimidating to think how expensive some of the instrument time could be if you're not part of a university. Most startups, maybe they'll kind of incubate at their PhD university for a year or two, but eventually they'll probably graduate from that, not officially graduate, but leave that program, and they'll need to still be making sure that their products that they're making are what they want to be making. So they need to do their quality control checks and things like that.
I'm really thrilled to hear that Folia Water is moving forward, and we thank you for taking the time today to chat with us and tell us a little bit more about the path that you've taken.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Stories from the NNI. If you would like to learn more about nanotechnology, please visit www.nano.gov and check back here for more stories.